They cast me out to die in the wilds, but instead of the monsters taking me, I found one who swore to guard me, even from my own people. They did not ring the bell for Mara when the gates closed. In their stories, bells tolled for births and weddings, for kings who died and harvests that failed. For exile they rang nothing, because exile was not a rite. It was an erasure, as swift and complete as wiping a name from fresh snow. Mara stumbled down the frost-gritted track with her hands bound in front of her, and the village's last words still clinging to her like burrs. Liar, witch, ungrateful. She had stood in the hall and told the truth about a man with a smooth smile and the mayor's eyes, a man who had cornered another girl in the granary and stolen her voice with his hand over her mouth. For that, she was here, with dusk already pooling blue at the roots of the pines and the wilds yawning open like the throat of some ancient thing. "Keep walking," said the guard who had drawn the lot to lead her to the boundary stone. He was careful not to touch her. Guilty people were permitted touch. They were jailed, tried, marked. Exiles were stains you did not smear with a hand. "I am walking," Mara said, and because her mouth had always been honest even when no one asked for honesty, she added, "Thank you for coming this far." He grunted, "I'll go no farther." They reached the boundary stone just as the first moths rose out of the weeds. The guard cut her bonds with a quick, almost embarrassed stroke of his knife. He turned at once and hurried back toward the gate, shoulders hunched as if her breath could bruise him. Mara stood alone and listened to his footfalls shrink and vanish, then to the greater silence gathering on the far side of the stone, no birds in the branches, no chatter of crickets. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still. Night in the wilds did not fall. It collected. It pooled in the hollows and stretched slow claws over the path. Mara pulled up the hood of her plain brown cloak and tightened it under her chin, fingers shaking. "You've always been plain," she told herself without heat. Plain face, plain clothes, plain voice. The kind of girl everyone expected to agree and apologize. The kind of girl who knew where to find burdock root and how to stitch a sleeping child's torn sleeve without waking him. The kind of girl no one expected to stand in a hall and say, "I saw his hand on her throat. I heard her say no." She stepped over the boundary stone. For a time, there was nothing but the sound of her boots on the path and the thin quickness of her breath. The pines stood so close their branches tangled, drawing the sky down into a narrow slit of darkening metal. Somewhere to her left, something moved with a wet, dragging patience. Mara kept to the track and tried not to think of the stories told in winter by firelight. Eye-bright wolves the size of draft horses, pale mimic birds that learned your mother's voice and called you into the bog, the bramblebacks whose thorn-studded shells hid a mouthful of needles. When the first howl came, it came from far ahead, and the hair lifted along her arms even under her cloak. Another answered it. Closer, too close. Mara stopped. She had no knife. Her hands were sore and empty where the rope had bitten, and she did not doubt the village's mercy. They did not ring bells, and they did not give exiles knives. The second howl rolled under the trees like a wave. She turned and saw them, not wolves, not anything that had ever been tamed, sleek shadows in the path, the moonlight turning their glass-thin wing membranes to silver as they flexed. Glass wings, she thought foolishly, because the name was childish and because naming a thing made it more like a story. The first of them stepped forward and revealed a narrow face with too many teeth and clever yellow eyes. It sniffed, and its breath showed white. Mara, who had mended sleeves and remembered herbs, who had said the wrong true things in rooms where men wore fine wool, lifted her hands as if she could make herself into a taller, fuller creature by arranging her fear differently. "Go on," she said, voice steady because her voice had always been steady even when her knees quivered. "I am not your meat." The glasswing cocked its head. Its twin moved soundless through the shadows to flank her. Mara took one small step back, and her heel caught a root, and her body betrayed her with an ungainly stagger that put her shoulder blades against the rough bark of a pine. She thought of the guard's hunched back. She thought of the girl in the granary who had not cried when Mara saw the bruises. She had simply pressed a hand to Mara's wrist and breathed like a swimmer counting strokes. The first glasswing coiled to spring. Something hit it from the side with the sound of branches breaking. The air filled with heat and a reek like iron left in rain. The second glasswing shrieked, a thin, human sound, and took 3 light steps backward, wings hissing as they mantled and shuddered. Through the thrashing sketches of shadow and tooth, she saw him. Her mind tried out words for him and rejected them as quickly. Not man, too broad across the shoulders, too long in the forearms, fingers ending in hooked dark claws. Not beast. The eyes were wrong, green gold, yes, and bright with an animal's decision, but layered with thought, the way the lake layered light in summer. The moon, should it ever claw through the branches, would find him bristled and furred in places and bare in others, a face that shaped syllables with care as if language were teeth that might bite him. She had never seen him, and yet she knew him. Everyone in the village knew the stories, the warden, the beast of Hollow Vale, the hunger of the wilds given a name and a boundary. He tore the first glasswing away from her with one wrenching motion and broke its neck so cleanly it seemed merciful. The second leapt for his throat. He turned into it, and the impact drove him down on one knee, one hand braced in the needles. Teeth found him, found the slope where fur thinned to muscle, and he made a low sound, not pain exactly, something older. He closed his claws around the glasswing's narrow chest and squeezed once. The body went slack. The only sound then was the slow spill of its blood into the pine needles and Mara's own breath, trying to remember the way it used to go. He lifted his head and looked at her. Mara realized distantly that this was the moment the winter stories cautioned you about, when the beast you call hero in the middle of a fight turns his bright eyes on you and remembers what you are. She did not run. She could not have run with the back of the tree pushed into her bones and the wild gravity of his gaze pinning her steady. He rose, the easy, elastic grace of him at odds with the blood on his chest, and came forward until the tips of his claws were a breath from the wool of her cloak. "You crossed," he said. His voice was rough wood against stone, but the shape of the words was careful. "Why?" "They cast me out," Mara said. "Most are cast," he answered, as if the distinction mattered. "I know." Her mouth was dry. "Thank you for killing them." He glanced down at the bodies in a motion that was almost human and almost not. "They would have done worse than kill you," he said, and stepped back. The change in distance let her lungs remember how to pull air. She did so, slow, his head tilted. "You are not crying." "Would it help?" Mara asked, not unkindly. "No." He studied her with attention like the tip of a knife. "Most beg." She thought of the guard again, the way he had trimmed mercy into the least task. "I don't know how." For a heartbeat, the night seemed to lean closer to hear his answer. He did not smile, it would have shown too many teeth, but something in his face uncoiled from the brutal logic of the fight. He tasted the air, a flicker of tongue against teeth so quick it might have been an accident. "They bound your hands," he said, noticing the angry rope marks, the skin rubbed raw at her palms. He pointed toward the path's shadowed curve. "There is a place not far that is not safe, but less unsafe. Come." "I don't want to trouble you," she said. "You are already a trouble," he replied, without malice. "If you stand here, the scavengers will come. They are patient." Mara looked at the glasswings and imagined what would come to pick them apart, and decided she had done enough of pretending to be smaller than the moment required. She stepped away from the tree and fell into step beside him. He moved with the soundless confidence of a thing that had never needed to announce itself. The path narrowed and turned, then split, and he took the branch that climbed toward a low ridge where the pines thinned and the sky opened, its metals cooled to pewter. From there she could see the dark sheet of the forest falling away like a cloak, stitched with a river's metal thread, and beyond that, the blacker smudge that would be the village wall. The gate was a nail head of light. She thought she could hear the bell the mayor's household rang for supper, and hated herself for the ache that leapt in her throat. The warden stopped beside a fallen log and looked at her hands again. "I will clean these," he said, and made a shallow gesture toward her palms that was both question and warning. "I can do it," Mara said. She slipped her small pack from her shoulder. They had let her keep that. How kind, and knelt. The pack held little: a rag of linen, a small, stoppered jar of rendered fat, a vial of willow bark tincture, a needle in a twist of cloth, a heel of bread. She wet the linen with a little of the tincture and dabbed at the raw places, hissed softly, did not pause. He watched her with interest that was too direct to be called curiosity. "You carry medicines." "I used to keep the herb beds," Mara said. "My mother's mother taught me. It stays in your hands even when no one needs it." "The village will need it," he said, inflection flat. "The village will not ask," she answered, and tied off the strip of linen with a neat knot. She looked up. "May I clean yours?" He blinked slowly, an animal's blink. Then he held out the forearm where the glasswing's teeth had found the soft place above his elbow. The wound was not as bad as it looked. Teeth had skidded on muscle, but it bled well. Mara drew closer, and the smell of him met her. Pine pitch and wet fur and the iron that bled from the glasswing, threaded through with something warm she could not name. She did not flinch. His breath eased in a way that only someone kneeling as near as she was could have observed. "What is your name?" she asked quietly, because tending a wound required a name to speak to it. He hesitated. "Riven," he said at last, as if it were something he was not often asked. "Mara," she said, and the sound of it in this place made it belong to her again. Riven watched her hands. "You are not as plain as they have decided," he said, not a compliment exactly, more like an observation. "Plain people are noticed less. You are seen." Mara laughed, small and without bitterness. "In the hall today I was seen very well indeed." "You spoke truth." His voice held no question. "I spoke what I saw." She tied a second knot, smaller, knuckle-tight. "I won't take it back." Riven lifted his arm and flexed the muscle, testing her work. Blood did not break the wrap. He seemed satisfied. "You will not live the night alone," he said, straightforward as a weather report. "There are others that hunt in packs. Come." He led her down from the ridge into a shallow cut in the earth where an old landslide had left a scoop of rock and old tree roots that made a low roof. He kindled a small fire with a sparing hand, and the light found the slopes of him. Fur curling and lying flat, green-gold eyes narrowing and softening, the line of his mouth shaping the heat. Mara ate the heel of bread in 3 small bites, and felt each go down like a prayer said in a language she had only ever overheard. "Sleep," Riven said. "I will keep watch." "You should sleep too," she said, because fairness lived in her as stubbornly as her honesty. "Wake me before dawn, and we can trade." He considered. "All right," he said finally, and the word was gentle. "Wake comes easily for me." Mara lay on her side with her pack for a pillow, the fire's small warmth painting her face, and listened to the wilds unfold new sounds around their little hole, the chitter of something passing in the bracken, the crackle of frost finding a leaf's last veins. Breath, hers, his. It seemed impossible that she would sleep. It seemed inevitable that she would. She slept. When she woke, it was to a stillness too complete to be chance. The fire had gone to coals. Riven sat in the mouth of their shelter, every line of him canted toward listening. The sky outside had lightened to a color like old bone. "What is it?" she whispered. His ears flicked toward her voice, and he made a small motion of warning. He pointed with his chin. On the path above them, a figure had appeared, then 2 more. Men from the village, wrapped in cloaks whose colors she knew like the backs of her own hands. One bent at the waist and studied the marks where a body had been dragged. Another lifted a hand, and the light caught the brass of the mayor's insignia at his wrist. They moved exactly like men who had learned not to think much about what they were doing. Mara's heartbeat went fierce and sick in her throat. Riven's hand, bigger than her face, each claw a curved blade, came up without looking and touched her shoulder. She stopped shaking. "They hunt you," he said, voice low but not surprised. "Of course they do," Mara said, steady again with effort. "If I live, I can speak again." Riven's ear twitched. "They fear your voice." "They should," she said, and though fear still traveled her bones like cold water, pride warmed a place behind her breastbone. "Do you know a way past them?" His teeth flashed. "This is my forest," he said, not with arrogance, but with a fact's plain weight. "They do not know its second paths." He led her along a shelf of stone that ran parallel to the track, under low-hung branches that brushed her hood and left cold water on her hair. They moved when the men did not look, and stopped when they did, and the space between sight and blindness felt all at once as thin as the skin inside a wrist. At a point where the path bent, Riven's hand closed over her forearm and drew her into a pocket of shadow that had not existed a moment before, a trick of roots and rock and small, careful movements that hid them as thoroughly as a trick of light. One of the men paused a body's length away and swore softly as he worried at a burr in his cloak's weave. He spat, adjusted the brass at his wrist as if to reassure himself it was still there, and walked on. When the men had passed, Riven did not release Mara's arm for a long breath. When he did, his hand fell away, as if he had remembered a rule late. "You will have to decide," he said as they moved again, "whether to run or to turn and bite." Mara glanced at him, at the curve of a cheekbone under fur, at eyes that did not look away first. "Which would you do?" "Alone?" He tipped his head. "Run. I am very good at it. With you?" He showed teeth. "Bite." Something in her loosened then, the tight place that had held all the hours between the hall and this one. She smiled without meaning to. "I am very plain," she said, "but I have good teeth." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if his body had remembered how to shape a laugh all the way. They walked until the trees thinned and the ground began to lift toward the spine of hills that hid the rest of the world. In the brightening morning, they came to a place where stones stood, 3 upright, one across their tops, older than the village and maybe older than the river. Riven stopped with a formality he had not shown the path or the men or even the glasswings. "Here," he said, "is a boundary you may cross safely in the day, but not at dusk. Shadows keep their teeth forever on this ridge. They bite at sunset." Mara ran her fingers along the weather-chewed face of one of the stones and felt the old cold there, a stored winter. "Is this where you live?" He made a small gesture toward the darker pines below the ridge. "No, this is where I was made." The word hung there, wrong and right in equal measure. Mara let the silence stand up around it, the way you let a tall child reach for a high shelf without help. "We tell stories about you," she said at last. "We say a woman who took a wrong path once met you, and you ate her shadow but not her body, and she returned to the village and lived a long time, but no sunlight ever warmed her. That is a poor story," he said mildly, and for the first time she heard a sadness so old it had forgotten itself. "I have eaten nothing that belonged to a woman. Shadows do not nourish." He paused. "I was man once. The wardens were men. The village gave us a great gift to make us. It was supposed to be an honor." His mouth thinned. "Or so they told us." "What gift?" Her voice gentled itself. "Names," he said simply. "We were given new ones that the wilds could not pronounce, and so the wilds could not swallow us as easily as it swallowed other men." He touched the stone with the back of his claws, careful. "Then we were given teeth for the dark. We forgot things we had not meant to forget. The village tried to forget us in return. It is easier to live beside a door if you pretend it is not a door. Who made you? She asked. He looked down the slope toward the dark pines again, toward the place where winter kept its hand on the earth even in summer. Men who wore brass, he said, tone neutral, then added, and women who were quick with their hands and slow with their sorrow. They cried when they bound our limbs for the turning, but they did not stop tying the knots. Mara thought of the brass at the hunter's wrist, the weight of metal that made men straighten and other men bend. The wind lifted a little and moved slowly through Riven's fur like a hand through barley. "What do you want?" she asked him. Riven's head turned, and the whole attention of him came to rest on her like a warm pelt. He did not answer quickly. "I want a day without a mouth in it," he said finally. "One day. No mouths to feed, no mouths to stop, no mouths to break with my hands. I want to sleep and not count heartbeats while I do it. I want to step into sunlight and not feel the pull of every shadow I have ever sworn to hold." He paused, and the next words softened in a way that made them more dangerous. "I want you to live." It should have sounded like a guard's vow. It did not. It sounded like the beginning of a truth he had not let himself say out loud before. Mara's throat ached again, but not with fear. "I want you to sleep without counting," she said. "I want you to have a name that your mouth likes to say." She reached up without thinking and smoothed one hand over the thick fur where his shoulder became his neck, a touch as careful as a blessing. He went very still and then, slowly, so slowly she might have imagined it, leaned into her palm. "Do your people teach you to touch without asking?" he said. And though the words could have bitten, they did not. They brushed. "My mother taught me to ask with my hand before I asked with my voice," Mara said. Her palm warmed where it lay. "To let someone say no without having to move their mouth." "What if I say yes?" Riven asked, very soft. "Then I will keep touching you until you say stop," she said simply, and did. They stayed at the stones until the sun climbed and the frost burned away. Then they went down into the next valley, where the river ran clear over a bed of rounded stone, and the banks were scrolled with deer tracks and the small arrow-like marks of foxes. Riven hunted and brought back a brace of conies with quick, efficient hands. He turned away while Mara dressed them, because some memory of human courtesy lived still in him like a bird at the rafters of an old barn. They ate, and the meat sat heavy and good in her stomach, and for a while it was possible to imagine that this was something else, a camping journey, a day stolen for no reason except the light on the water. It could have been more days like that. Riven knew paths the villagers forgot when the first generation of wardens went to Claw and Shadow. He showed her a hollow where the wind could not find you, a shelf in a rock face where slow honey pooled, a place where the earth gave off heat for no reason anyone had ever dug out of it. At night she slept, and he counted heartbeats, and then he slept, and she counted birds, waking. In the small daylight between fear and hunger and moving, they put words on pieces of themselves, the way he liked the smell of crushed pine needles, the way she liked to stand with boots in the river and feel cold stones move underfoot like fish. But you cannot live even on small, good days when men with brass at their wrists want you dead because your mouth forms the shapes of truth. On the fourth morning, they found tracks where they had not left any. Riven crouched to study them, and the fur along his spine rippled, each hair standing at attention. 3, he said, and a dog. No, 2 dogs. Big. No. He tilted his head. Not dogs. They will bite like dogs anyway. What do we do? Mara asked. The same thing we have been doing, Riven said. We move, but we will not be gentle with the path this time. They climbed into the broken land where old fire had come long ago, blackening the bones of trees and leaving raw the heave of rock. There were caves there. There were places where the ground rang underfoot like something hollow, and if you stamped hard, you woke the small, angry lives under it. Riven threaded them between these with the attention of a weaver pulling a bright thread through a dark cloth. Twice he stopped and made her listen to something she could not at first hear. The very high whine of a thing that loved blood, the faint clack of two carapaces brushing like dice. Twice she put her hand in his fur without meaning to, and he did not move it. When the men came, they did not call to her. They did not bargain. They moved with the silence of people who had spent several days deciding they were right. The first stepped into the open between two slagged stumps with his bow raised and his face empty. Riven hit him so fast Mara did not see the space between first step and impact. One moment man, one moment a scuffle of limbs and a sound like a green branch being twisted too far. The second was not so surprised. He loosed an arrow, and it entered Riven under the collar of fur at his chest and buried itself to the fletching. Riven made that old, low sound again and kept coming. The third shouted an order to the dogs, and they fanned out. Not dogs at all, but bristlebacked things with faces like badgers and long, wet tongues that gave away how they liked to feed. "Riven," Mara said, because his name was a kind of spell for her now. He heard her inside the heavy sound of his heart and turned just enough to put his body between her and the first bristleback. It sprang and hit him high, claws scrabbling for purchase in fur and muscle. He caught it at the hinge of its jaw and forced it open until something gave. Blood coated his hands like oil. Mara did not run. Running would have left him alone in a fight he had taken on because of her, and the fairness that lived under her ribs would not allow it. She snatched a rock the size of a soup bowl from near her boot and hit the second bristleback across the muzzle as it lunged for Riven's exposed side. It yelped, the sound wrong for its body, and drew back, shaking its head in fury and confusion. The third hunter's arrow brushed her cheek with its fletching and stuck quivering in the earth behind her. The one Riven had hit first struggled up with the careful steadiness of someone recounting his limbs. "Take the woman," the third said, and the brass at his wrist flashed like a small sun. "We'll drag her home and let her explain herself in pieces." Mara straightened. "You had a chance to do things cleanly," she said, voice as even as it had been in the hall, as if she were discussing weather. "You failed." Riven lifted his head and looked at her, then as if he were seeing not a girl in a brown cloak, but a bell someone had forgotten to ring. Something in his face changed. He took a step forward, and the bristleback hanging from his arm fell away like a badly thought idea. He reached up and closed his hand around the arrow in his chest and broke the shaft off with 2 fingers. He did not pull it free. He did not need to. He was moving. What happened then was brutal and quick. Later, Mara would remember it in slices, as if memory were a loaf and someone had cut it into pieces. Riven's shoulder slamming into a hunter's stomach, the arrow's shaft jerking, her own rock rising and falling, and the feeling in her palm after, a bone-deep throb that did not belong wholly to pain or triumph. The bristleback's teeth finding the meat of her calf and the sudden white light at the edge of her vision. Then quiet. No, not quiet. The sound of the wind coming back now that the men had stopped moving. The sound of blood making itself known to the air. Riven stood with his feet planted and his arms loose at his sides. He was breathing quickly. He was not shaking. The brass at a wrist lay in the dust. Mara's leg burned like a line drawn in fire. She put one hand on a tree and let the bark hold her up. When she looked at the faces of the men, they were only faces. None of them belonged to the smooth smile that had set her feet on this path. The wilds had made its own sort of justice, and the village would need to settle accounts with the shadow of that and with her voice. Riven looked at her leg and came to her very carefully, the way you approach a wild thing. "Let me carry you," he said. It did not sound like an offer. It sounded like a fact he needed the world to accept. "If you carry me, we will both fall down the hill," Mara said between her teeth. "I am not as light as women who can be carried." "I am strong," he said, almost offended, and then softened. "But all right. Lean." She leaned. He put an arm around her waist, the weight of it a band of heat bracketed by claw and muscle. Together they climbed out of the fire-burned hollow and into a grove of young birches whose white skins peeled like paper. Riven tore strips of it with quick, clean strokes and bound them over the tear in her leg, then over his chest where blood had blacked his fur. Mara watched his hands and thought of the women with their slow sorrow and their quick fingers tying knots. "You should have killed them all," she said, chest heaving. "I did," Riven said, tone so gentle she almost laughed. "I mean the men who made you." His mouth shaped a smile without opening. "They were already dead by the time I decided I might like to." Mara sat with her back against a birch and let sunlight spill on her face. It had been days since she and the sun had appeared in the same sentence. Riven settled across from her, one knee up, one arm draped over it. He had pulled the broken arrow free, and the hole it left looked like something small had gone out to look at the world and forgotten to return. "What now?" she asked. He did not rush his answer. "You can keep running with me," he said. "We can live 2 valleys over where the river makes fog every morning, and sometimes at dusk you can see deer's breath like smoke. I know hidden places there. The wilds take what they are owed, but they will leave the rest to us. And the village will say, 'I died,'" she said, filling in the next part of the story they both knew the outline of. "And the girl in the granary will learn what women learn about swallowing their own tongues." Riven's ears went back a fraction. "You could also go home and burn the hall down." Mara considered. She had never been the kind of girl who decided a hall should burn and then struck a spark. She had been the kind of girl who tended the flame in the bread oven at 3 in the morning, so the loaves the village loved would be ready by 8. But sometimes you learned you were a person who could stand in a room and say, "I saw," and not apologize afterward. Sometimes you learned the thing you were good at was not a thing anyone praised. "If I go back," she said slowly, "it cannot be the same way. They will ring no bells for me, and the gate will be only wood. I will need a door that doesn't belong to them." Riven's gaze came up to meet hers, and she had the mad thought that he had been waiting his whole long, hungry life for someone to say exactly that. "I am a door," he said simply. They went back at noon when the sun was high and shadows were shortest. It felt like walking into the mouth of a thing that had fallen asleep with its jaw open. Riven did not hide. The villagers on the wall saw him, and the breath went out of them like wind out of a sail. Men with bows peered over the parapet and then peered again because the thing they had learned to fear was standing in the clear, and yet no one had taught them what to do next. Mara stood 2 paces in front of Riven and planted her feet. The gate did not open. That was all right. She had not expected it to. She lifted her chin and pitched her voice so that the words would carry cleanly along the wall. "You threw me out," she said. "I lived anyway. The men you sent after me will not be coming back." A murmur ran along the wall like a cat. The guards at the parapet did not look at one another. They looked at the brass on their own wrists. "I spoke truth," Mara said, "and I will speak it until it is done. If you do not open your gate, I will say it here at your wall every day until the wilds or the winter kills me." She paused. "And I will not be alone." That made them look at Riven. He did not bare his teeth or make himself larger. He simply stood where he stood, and the wrongness of a door in the forest standing at your gate was louder than any threat. The mayor himself came up then, the brass at his sleeve bright as if someone had polished it for this very hour. His mouth had the shape of a smile and the eyes of a winter pond. "Child," he said, and the word was an insult where it landed in the air. "You have returned to ask forgiveness. That is wise. Come in and we can speak softly." "I will not speak softly," Mara said. "I will speak where everyone can hear." "About my son," he said, and now the smile's shape slipped. "Be careful. You do not know what you say." "I know exactly what I say." She took a breath and felt the birch bark bite under it. She smelled Riven's heat at her back. She heard the Rawbone River that ran under the gate somewhere behind the wall. I say that he put his hand on Sarah's throat in the granary and took what she did not give. I say he liked her silence. I say you taught him to like it. A stir at the edge of the crowd that had gathered. Women pulling shawls tighter, men shifting their weight and not knowing why. Somewhere a child laughed at a thing that had nothing to do with any of it, and was shushed so sharply the quiet after tasted of iron. Riven said nothing, and the nothing of it mattered. He did not snarl, he did not lift his hands. He was a door where a wall thought it had been a world. The mayor's mouth thinned. "You bring a monster to our gate and expect us to believe you are clean," he said. "Look at you, bramble-blooded, witch-proud." Mara stepped forward one pace, and the archers on the wall tightened their bows with a sound like dry grass. She ignored them. "Open the gate," she said, "and let Sarah choose where she stands." It was simple, and it was a blade. Sarah's name lived in the village like a thread that had caught on splinters everywhere. If the mayor said no, if he made a spectacle of refusal, the thread would pull loose and everyone would see what had always been the shape of the cloth. If he said yes, he risked the only thing men like him ever thought they owned completely. The story. The mayor lifted a hand. The gate ground open on its hinges, the sound old and much oiled. Riven did not move. Mara did not look back. The villagers drew themselves into the square, pulled by the gravity of a thing standing up to be counted. Sarah came from the baker's door with flour climbing her hands to the wrists. She looked at Mara first, and in that look there was a life's worth of words. Then she looked at the mayor. Then at the space where the mayor's son should have stood, which was empty because he had not thought there would be any need of him today. "Mara speaks true," Sarah said in a voice like clean water. If there was any sound after that, it was the sound of the world rearranging itself around the weight of a word that could not be unsaid. The brass at the mayor's wrists looked suddenly like something you wore because you were afraid of dropping it. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. One of the archers on the wall made a small, involuntary sound and lowered his bow. A woman in the crowd took Sarah's flour-whitened hand and held it as if it were a live coal that would burn her in a way she had been cold for years. Riven came then, one step forward, no more. He did not enter the gate because he was older than any invitation. He simply stood where every eye could see him. The sun found him, found the blood dried at his chest and the birch bark darkening over it, found the fur that lifted with his breath, found the eyes that were not human and held still anyway. "This one," he said quietly, and his voice carried more cleanly than anger would have, "will not die. Not while I stand." It was not a threat. It was an oath. Some oaths you learned to live with because you liked what came after. The village learned very quickly which kind this was. They did not put the mayor's son on a scaffold. The wilds did not return what it ate that way. They put him in the hall and asked him questions with everyone watching, and when he gave answers that did not make shapes that matched, they set him outside the gate with a pack full of the good bread he had always taken and the water that did not know how to forgive. The bell did not ring for him either. It did not ring for the mayor, who loosened the brass at his wrists as if it had turned to nettles and left it on the table and walked to the edge of the square without looking anyone in the eye. It rang for Sarah when she married a man she liked 4 summers later because someone remembered the bell was not to blame for anything. For a time, Mara and Riven lived near. He did not like walls, but he learned to sit with his back to the linden in the square while children pressed close enough to touch his fur and then ran screaming with laughter when he flicked an ear. He did not come into houses because he was not a creature of roofs. He watched from shade when they gave her back the herb beds, and he watched with an attention that made the women at the well talk low about what it is like to be looked at as if you were a river after drought. He slept, the first spring after, a whole day and a half without counting his heartbeats. When he woke, he found he had dreamed of nothing, no teeth, no brass, no blood, but of light through leaves. He went to the edge of the beds where Mara sat with dirt under her nails and said, with wonder he did not try to hide, I slept. Mara wiped her hands on her skirt and rose, and the smile she gave him made his body understand something his mouth was still learning to say. "Good," she said. "Again tonight." They were careful, not because either of them feared the other, but because they both understood the long gravity of choices. The wilds did not stop wanting. It wanted what the wilds always want: the next meal, the next mouth, the next warm thing to cool. It also wanted what the wilds occasionally grew old enough to want: to be asked, to be chosen. Riven had been made to hold the line where choice ended. Mara had been taught to swallow her own mouth. They met between those truths. He would sleep sometimes under the linden, and she would sit near his shoulder and lean back a little until her hair lay along his fur like a spill of river grass. He would go with her to gather willow bark along the bank where the Rawbone River slowed around its big stones, and she would show him where to step, because even things that know the dark sometimes forget how the light hides depth. He learned to cook meat so that the outside crisped and the inside stayed soft. She learned how to move between his ribs when he woke from an old memory and thought briefly with his teeth. Once, in late summer when the fields were heavy and the sky laid a hand on the back of your neck and pressed, a trader came to the village square with a string of bells made in another town where people thought brass was for cows. He shook them to show their voice. Riven's ears flattened, and he laughed under his breath the way he did now sometimes, that half-startled sound of a door that had been stuck for years opening because a child put a softer hand to it. He bought a bell for one of the baker's children with a pouch of teeth he had taken from a thing that had tried to make a meal of him. The child hung it on the linden, and for a month every wind said, "I'm here." When autumn came, Mara went to the hall where the mayor's chair sat empty and said, "I want a seat at the table," and no one laughed. She did not rule anything. She did not like ruling the way men who wore brass seemed to. She measured her days in loaves and poultices and words that held their shape. She said, "We will stop pretending the wilds are only teeth. We will remember who built the wardens and who tied their knots. We will stop calling everything we do not understand a demon and start calling it by its proper name." She did not say Riven. She never had to. He was the proper name for himself. The first winter after she returned was hard. The Rawbone threw ice like broken plates. Bramblebacks came down out of the hills in more brazen pairs than usual, hungry as men after a harvest festival. The village learned new ways to put light around doorways. Mara learned that dried yarrow kept longer if you hung it in the root cellar next to onions, and that she liked the taste of onion on Riven's mouth. Riven learned that if you sat very still near the child who had hung the bell, the child would fall asleep against your side with complete faith, and you would feel a thing you had not had a word for since you turned, trusted. They did not marry in a hall. The hall had its place, and that place was not large enough to hold what they were. In spring, when the snow rotted from the ditches and the first green went tentative across the fields like a shy girl on market day, they stood by the standing stones with two friends and Sarah and the child who had hung the bell. Riven wore nothing but himself. Mara wore a dress so plain it could have been any day, and a ribbon in her hair that was not plain at all. They circled the stones, and he said, in a voice with no roughness left in it anywhere, "I will stand between you and teeth." And she said, "I will stand between you and forgetting." And the child rang the bell until his arms ached. They did not need the village to bless them. The village did anyway when the first berries came on the brambles, and the bakers threw handfuls of sugar at the linden, and the old women put their lips together and nodded once or twice, like people who had lived long enough to see a story end the way it should have sooner. There were still things with teeth. There were still men who liked silence that was not their own. The wilds did not bow its head and go tame because two people said kind words to each other at a stone. But a good story puts a weight on the scale that was not there before. Years later, when children asked why the bell on the linden said, "I'm here," Mara would say, "It's because someone you love is near." When they asked what the wilds wanted, Riven would say, "Exactly what you want when you have not eaten yet. Enough." When they asked whether he had always been a warden, he would say, I have always been riven. When they asked how two things that should not have fit could live where they lived, he would say, because Mara wanted a door more than a wall. And Mara would roll her eyes and then kiss his fur, and the children would giggle because kissing fur felt funny on your lips. On the coldest nights, when the raw bones snapped and the stars burned with the clean light of far ice, Riven still woke sometimes with his heart counting itself like coins in a miser's hand. Mara would turn and press her palm to his chest and say, "Again tonight," and his heart would stop counting and go on beating because a hand was just a hand and a mouth was just a mouth, and sometimes, if you were lucky, they belonged to someone who had chosen you on a day when the sun found you where you stood. Once, only once, when spring was late and anger ran high in men with nothing better to do than be angry, a stranger at the market spat the word monster at Riven's back. The square went quiet the way it had the day of the gate, as if the world were listening to itself decide what to do. Mara turned and looked at the stranger for a long time, not unkindly, with the patient heat of a black stove. "Names matter," she said, not loud, and Riven felt the word move the air in his chest. The stranger lowered his eyes and said sorry, and it sounded like someone practicing a new word. The world did not applaud. The world simply did not break. When Riven died, he did not die. He stood at the boundary stones one morning many years after the first and said, "I think I will go farther today." And Mara, older and not plain at all to anyone who had learned how to see, said, "I think I will go with you part of the way." And they walked together to the place where the shadows kept their teeth. He went on alone because there are some paths you take with your own feet. He did not look back because he did not have to. He carried the smell of crushed pine needles and onion and river stones with him. He carried the taste of clean bread and clean words. He carried a bell's voice in his ear. He carried the shape of a hand on his chest, the one that asked without a mouth. Mara stood until the sun had moved the length of a hand, and then she went home by a second path no one else knew because she had learned from the best. She did not sit in the hall. She went to the herb beds. She tied yarrow in neat bunches. She told a child not to eat all the berries before supper. She rang the bell once, and it said, "I'm here." And the sound went out over the wilds like the softest, truest kind of spell. There are still stories. People still tell the one about the girl who was plain enough to see things clearly, and the warden who remembered how to carry a name in his mouth without being bitten by it. When the wind lifts the fur at the back of your neck in the pines and you don't feel fear, that is him. When truth lands in a room like a dove and no one chases it out the window with a broom, that is her. When you stand at a door and decide to open it instead of leaning your shoulder to it forever, that is both of them, standing just out of sight with hands ready to catch you if you fall and mouths that speak the simplest vows. I will stand between you and teeth. I will stand between you and forgetting. I'm here. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.